And welcome in to the latest edition of Fourth Down in the Steel City alongside Josh Taylor. I'm Chris Mack. And if you're watching this on the 93.7 The Fan YouTube page, thank you so much. I think we're well up over 1,000 views for all of our post-game episodes, some of which we do live right here on the 93.7 The Fan YouTube page as soon as the game is over, including this past Thursday.
Those are just a big old party, if we're being honest.
It was. Snacks, drinks, and we rocked it. That's how we do on Fourth Down in the Steel City, especially for a live post-game edition of the show. But it's available as a podcast, and you could go listen to it in case you missed our breakdown, our opinions, our thoughts on the Thursday night victory over the Tennessee Titans, and any podcast you may have missed. Make sure you go to wherever you get your podcasts. Josh may be pointing to it right now. However you get it, follow, subscribe, download, and by all means, rate, review, leave comments as well. We appreciate all of them, even the haters. And keep coming on back. Yeah, I'm going to speak English today as we break down the Mike Tomlin Tuesday press conference. Thank you again, however you get it, for listening. Make sure your Odyssey app, it's free. Download it today, AUDACY. You follow the podcast in there as well. You'll get notified as soon as new episodes are available. But a little bit of a mini bye. And so a nice long weekend for the Steelers. They get back to it today. And getting back to it includes questions about George Pickens, a comparison to a pebble in the shoe, questions about both starting tackles, the rookie corner who had another big game, the injury situation. But let's start with our guy, Mike Pursuta from the Steelers Radio Network, who asked a pretty straightforward question, I thought, about Kenny Pickett and his performance in the first three quarters as it relates to his performance in the fourth quarter. And Mike Tomlin chose to focus on the fourth quarter performance rather than the first three quarters. Josh, we've talked about this all year. It's going to continue to be a thing as long as fourth quarter Kenny continues to be a thing. But it is a thing, which, by the way, we'll get into later. We'll play a rousing edition of Is This a Thing? But I appreciate his highly diplomatic answer in public. I got to believe behind the scenes, Mike Tomlin is racking his brain just like the rest of us, trying to figure out how the heck you get Kenny Pickett, fourth quarter Kenny, to show up in the first three quarters.
I thought two things about this. One, I thought the way that Mike Tomlin was very tongue-in-cheek with Mike Pursuta about it was fun, because he goes, "Why didn't you just ask it from that perspective?" I thought that was pretty funny. And there's a lot of back and forth there. And if you've covered that beat at any point, you know the relationship Mike Pursuta has with the players and with the coaching staff and with the organization in general. Mikey P is one of the best, by the way. One of the best guys over there and one of the best guys on that beat. So it's always fun. And it's usually, and Mike is never a contentious guy. Not that he doesn't want to ask the tough questions, because Mike does ask tough questions. But, I thought the way they handled that tongue-in-cheek was pretty cool. The second thing is, and I think this is one of those things that people don't seem to appreciate about Mike Tomlin, but players do. Mike Tomlin is not going to come out and say, well, Kenny needs to be better in the first three quarters of the game. He's going to say, you know what? Kenny's really great in the fourth quarter. He's going to emphasize that thing that Kenny does well, because but at the same time, when it comes time to get ready for the week, whenever he talks to Kenny Pickett or Matt Canada or Mike Sullivan, he's going to say, look, how can we fix this problem with the first three quarters? Like, it's good to have this in our back pocket.
Right.
I don't think that they're settling for that just because they're not freaking out about it publicly, because everybody else is freaking out about it publicly. I don't think they're actually okay with it. They're just not going to tell you that they're freaking out about it or what they're doing to fix it.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to look at it. We'd all be ignorant to not pay attention to the fact that Pickett is a different quarterback in the first three quarters than he is in the fourth quarter. Mike Tomlin is just choosing with a young quarterback that, let's be honest, he hasn't given up on yet, because the organization hasn't given up on yet, because hell, half the fan base hasn't given up on him yet. Needs as much positive reinforcement as he can get, right? Like 3 weeks ago, I remember sitting here talking about Kenny Pickett's confidence and the offense's confidence and how none of them had any of it. And they walk out there on the field. It reminds me of, and I'm going to paraphrase because I don't remember the exact quote, but this is way back. There's at least a generation and a half ago. Jason Bay was with the Pirates at the time. So It gives you an idea of how old this is. And Jason Bay was asked at some point about the Pirates and just their overall demeanor. And there was a year where, I don't know, maybe they had rattled off 5 or 6 in a row. So they were playing well at the time. And everybody thought they were turning a corner, which we all now know never really happened while Jason Bay was a Pittsburgh Pirate. But everybody thought maybe they were turning a corner. And he said something to the effect of, well, we're playing like we expect to win, not like we hope to win. What I saw from the Steelers for the first time in a few weeks against Tennessee was an offense that looked like it expected to score, not like it was surprised it was scoring. And for a couple of weeks, for like a month and a half, this offense as a whole, Matt Canada in the booth, Kenny Pickett on the sideline, all of them looked like they were genuinely surprised when they scored rather than they were expecting to score. That confidence, I feel like, has turned a little bit, and I don't think Mike Tomlin wants to mess with that at all.
Well, God forbid someone on this offense uses the term hope a second time this season, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
You don't want to make the same mistake twice if you're George Pickens. But no, to your point, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that element to it was something that probably doesn't get emphasized as much. I know it gets mentioned just because of the fact that it had been so long, but I don't think we realized just how big that first drive touchdown was.
Enormous.
I don't think for this group, for any other group, it's ho-hum, whatever. For this group, it's huge.
It's like a high school kid walking up to the girl that he has a crush on, thinking she's not gonna say yes. She's not gonna say yes. She's not gonna say yes. And he asks her out on a date. She's like, yeah, sure. What are you doing Friday? That's exactly what it was. It was, oh, I'm a man now. Look at me. First drive touchdown.
It was Little Giants. They go the yard. Like, that's what it was.
Yes.
But you needed to get to that moment. And we had talked so much about how this offense needs to do this offense needs to do that. All right, you did it. What are you going to do next? And I'm thinking that that's probably what their mindset is. I'm hoping that's what their mindset is for their own sake. But yeah, like you got to get through that hurdle first in order to get to the next one.
And I do wonder how much Matt Canada being down there to have a more direct line of communication with Kenny Pickett mattered. Maybe Pickett's just at a point in his development where he needs to feel like he can bounce things off of Matt Canada the whole time they're on the sidelines. And maybe it's harder for him. I imagine it would be harder for any quarterback to walk over, pick up the phone or pick up the headset, call up to the booth and say, hey, what'd you think of this? Okay. And then it's just different, you know? It's different when someone is right there and you can have that conversation with them face to face. I think that I have to believe that had some kind of impact.
Yeah, and Kenny Pickett talked about it after the game. He even talked about how he says, we have good discussions over the phone, but by we, he meant him and Matt Canada, but it's a two-sided conversation. Mm-hmm. There's no one else involved with that. But he also mentioned bringing him down to the sideline. He got to interact with the other guys. He got to talk to the other coaches, and then you get to a better consensus off of what's necessary. And the thing about that first drive, Chris, you and I talked about it after the game. There's a whole lot of balance on that first drive. There's a whole lot of efficiency on that first drive. There were third downs converted on that first drive. All of that stuff was happening at the same time. Not to mention, you were getting good protection up front for Kenny Pickett. He didn't get sacked the whole game. You're getting good blocking on the offensive line. Mike Tomlin talked about Broderick Jones being inserted into the starting lineup and how much he helped in the run game, particularly at the second level, which, by the way, if you're in the scheme that this group is in, being able to get to the second level and get guys blocked out is going to help you get bigger runs that we've always been talking about that this offense needed. So all of these things are happening all at the same time. And then the result is the first round touchdown. It was almost like I said this before, I'm looking around like, where are we? Where do we end up? Because this is not familiar territory. But now that you got there, can you get to the next milestone?
Right. And the other side of the coin is while the offense, I don't want to say flourished, but showed some positive signs on Thursday night, we had another difficult day for George Pickens. And you and I talked about this on your Sunday afternoon show on 93.7 The Fan. I am of the mind that George Pickens blowing off some steam on social media is just that. It's a 22-year-old kid. I hate to call him a kid because he's a grown man, but
we're old enough to be his parents. We can call him kids.
Exactly. I mean, as much as he's a grown man and can be responsible for grown-ass man decisions, he's still young enough that there's some immaturity in there and there's some frustration in there. And Mike Tomlin was asked about dealing with young players in that frustration, and he told Brooke Pryor, when asked how you handle it, like breathing. It's easy. I know it's a cute story for you guys, but it's a pebble in my shoe, to be quite honest with you, in terms of the things that I have to do in an effort to get this group ready to play. It's like reality television, the way you guys follow social media and write stories about it. He's not wrong about that last part. It is.
He really isn't.
Like I don't follow a lot of players on social media because, to be quite honest, 90% of what gets posted is 98% of what gets posted is meaningless to me. And I think meaningless to most fans, right? But you get the 2% occasionally that makes you go, really? And that was what the George Pickens post was on his Instagram story last week. But in the end, I still believe it has no impact on the South Side. It has no impact in the room. It has no impact on the field on Sunday until you see an outburst like that go from social media outburst, if you want to call it that, to real life outburst. And when I talked to Kabali about it, he made a good point. He's like, it doesn't really bother me at all either, because the same thing, we're all in our mid 40s and like, we don't even understand half of what's out there on social media anyway, much less how to decipher it. But he said the one thing he didn't like, and there's video of it, was when Deontay Johnson scored his touchdown. Keep in mind, it's a man's first touchdown in 2 years. There wasn't George Pickens running over to congratulate him or to be a part of the celebration. And I will agree with Kabali there. That's the one thing I will keep an eye on is what happens on the green grass on Sundays. What happens on the sidelines? What, do we get guys throwing helmets or slamming iPads or anything like that? That's when I'll start to worry about it maybe becoming a distraction. Until that stuff happens, I'm not worried about it.
Yeah, that was when I saw that video from that perspective near the end zone. I thought that was a pretty telling thing too. I thought you brought good perspective to it when you and I talked Sunday afternoon. And you mentioned it. And the fact that you have a 14-year-old daughter, I think helps with your perspective. And I think you mentioned a part that we didn't really say out loud. He was probably really angry with himself in that situation because he had the opportunity to do that earlier, do that exact same thing. He didn't do it, and it was his own fault. He's probably mad at himself. And in that being mad at himself probably took away from being able to celebrate with his teammate, like whom you said hadn't scored a touchdown in 2 years. And Pickens has scored a couple of significant ones already this season. I think looking back, he probably would regret that because it's one of those situations where you're kind of wallowing in your own, like beating yourself up. And you kind of take away from everything else happening around you. And we all do that. It's just, it's human emotion. It's the human condition. But I think what you mentioned about having a teenage daughter and dealing with the emotions and things that kids have, I think Mike Tomlin took what you said and pretty much adjusted it to his own filter. Because besides having children of his own, Mike Tomlin has children that are George Pickens' age,
right,
or around George Pickens' age. He's got one still in college playing football. So he understands right now, probably more than most of us, what a guy like George Pickens in that age group is dealing with or what he's thinking about or the different emotions running through. So he's got a handful of those kids in that age group at home or at least in his family. They may not all be at home, but you understand where I'm going with this. Yeah. Who better to understand what a young 22-year-old kid is dealing with than a guy who has kids in their 20s? They're going to be able to understand that and filter it a lot better than most people would. From the coaching side of it, I think he's supposed to look at it that way. I think he needs it to be a pebble in his shoe because if you're a head coach who makes that bigger than what it is, that's taking your attention from something else that should be a bigger problem. So I don't mind the way he's approaching it. I think that from the standpoint of being a coach, I think he's handling it the way he should. And I think from the standpoint of being a parent, having kids in that age range, he understands how to navigate that situation.
Yeah, I mean, look, whether we like it or not, we sometimes project our own age and experience and maturity levels onto these professional athletes. Because
and the older we get, the more we do it.
Yep. And the more out of touch we get with the more we have to remind ourselves. Exactly. Like I got to remind myself, okay, 22, where were you, Chris? Oh, you were still in college. You were, let me think. Oh, at George Pickens' age, you were, yeah. Oh, I remember. Yep. You remember some of the things you did then? Were they wildly immature? Can you imagine what would happen if social media had existed, for example, then? I don't want to. So I think we all need to take that step back and go, listen, I understand he's a professional athlete. He does carry, he's got to carry a little bit more responsibility on his shoulders than maybe you or I did as kids when we were in college at that age.
Yep.
But we do have to remind ourselves that nobody's perfect and that each of these things that's happened along the way is a learning opportunity. And you just hope that they start to stack up and he starts to accumulate that wisdom at a much younger age than, to be quite honest, probably either one of us did at that age, because we didn't have the same harsh glare of a media spotlight or a fan group that spans the globe, really, calling us on all of our little immature mistakes that we make. And in the grand scheme of things, like you said, as it relates to the football on the field, this is a little immature mistake by George Pickens that, like you said, he probably looks back on and says, yeah, I could have handled it better, but I got in my feels, and it happens. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and it also helps when you have a guy like Allen Robinson, who I thought really had a great diplomatic answer about this. He says, look, you got to keep talking to him. You got to, explain to him that, there are going to be days where this happens to you. And Allen Robinson's been around the league for quite some time now. He's been up and through this, and he's dealt with all the ups and downs. It's one of those things where, hey, you got to talk to him and say, hey, you're going to have these days. I thought Kenny Pickett handled this really well too. And this is one of those intangible things that I think makes Kenny Pickett good for this team. I know a lot of people like to look at the negative things, but one of the intangible things that I think makes him good for this team is he's able to understand and appreciate everything that guys do and how they help. And I thought he talked about it after the game. He said, look, we're in a lot of the positions we're in right now because George attracts a lot of the attention that he does. They get double teamed, so it helps out other guys in the passing game. They're worried about him on first and second down, so it helps out the run game because that's another set of eyes that are more focused on him than maybe on the line of scrimmage. Having a guy like that not only helps you with what he does when he has the ball in his hands, but it helps you when he doesn't have the ball in his hands, when the ball doesn't go in his direction, because you have to start to account for what he can do. And it kind of dovetails into what Mike Tomlin talked about on the other side of the ball with Joey Porter Jr. He says, look, one thing you guys did not talk about was him being involved with DeAndre Hopkins. That helped out a lot because anytime they ran the ball, they went opposite of Hopkins' direction. So you kind of didn't have to worry about Joey Porter Jr. figuring in and how he might handle trying to be involved with tackling a Derrick Henry or a Tajay Spears, because he's handling the guy that's away from all of it because they don't run in Hopkins' direction, which I think, by the way, is a very good thing to look at and point out and exploit. So that was actually smart on their end. But when you understand what exactly the impact you have is, I think it helps your perspective more. And I think with guys like Robinson and Pickett taking him aside and saying, look, we were able to do this because of you. And you were able to do this earlier, but now since guys know you can do that, we're able to do this because they know you can do that. And there's going to come a time when they get focused on guys, other things that other guys can do, and they're going to come right back around to him, i.e. Baltimore. Baltimore became a situation where Baltimore's defense was more focused on what the rest of the offense can do, and it turned into a one-on-one situation outside with George Pickens, and it turned into the go-ahead touchdown. That became the eventual game winner. It's just a matter of being able to handle one side of the ledger and balance it out with the other side.
So I want to have time to get to Is This a Thing? Because we have a multitude of issues, and I want to get into the strength of schedule thing that I took a look at this morning inside my eye-opener column for 937thefan.com. But a couple more just personnel issues real quick. Minkah Fitzpatrick sounds like by the end of the week may be out there on the practice field. I don't know how much I'm holding my breath for that. Doesn't sound like Mark Robinson's immediately going to get launched into the inside linebacker rotation. It's just going to be Landon Roberts and Quan Alexander, which I'm fine with. I'll miss Cole Holcomb, but
as will I,
especially in coverage.
He was fantastic in coverage.
Which Landon Roberts I worry about, but here nor there. But it sounds like they are open though to using Keanu Neal in some of those situations, which I like. But the tackle situation, I'm trying to read between the lines a little too much here, maybe, but to me, this sounds like Broderick Jones is starting at right tackle again on Sunday, and Mike Tomlin just doesn't want to commit to that yet. You got an or on the depth chart. You got some quotes that sound like, we'd like to get a longer look at that. Yeah, Dan Moore's much better on the left side. Yeah, Chooks definitely screwed up in whatever he did towards the end of the Jacksonville game. This is all lining up towards Chooks Okorafor and that cap hit maybe at the end of the year being a sayonara because they found their guy at the right tackle spot.
I'm going to take this all the way back to the end of last year. I was on the Locked On Steelers podcast with Chris Carter, and we were talking about specific guys that could potentially be cap casualties down the road. And the one guy we got to was Chooks Okorafor. And I used this term back then. I said this had to be a poo or get off the pot season for Chooks. And it looks like the Steelers are getting off the pot. It just has that feeling to it.
Yeah.
And I'm with you on this. It's like you don't want to read too far between the lines, but sometimes with Mike Tomlin, you have to, because remember we said last week, the bagpipe isn't always going to say no.
Right.
And for the second week in a row, the bagpipe didn't say no, which leads me to believe, and then you see that or on the depth chart, usually college teams do that.
Yeah.
NFL teams don't do that often. So if you see an or there's that shadow of a reasonable doubt that usually has a lot more weight in the courtroom, but it has weight in the situation too. That or says a lot to me, which leads me to believe that Broderick Jones is going to be the guy. And honestly, looking at the tape, how do you say no at this point? Because everything Broderick Jones does, it kind of outweighs the things that Chooks can do. We're not just talking about can he pass block, can he run block. We're not just talking about that. We're talking about can you wipe Harold Landry off the zip code on the outside in the pass block game.
Right.
We're talking about can you get to the second level and take dudes out and spring Najee Harris for a 10-yard run on the first drive of the game type stuff. That stuff Broderick Jones does, and that's stuff that we never saw Chooks Okorafor do. So I think it's pretty simple at this point.
Yeah, and they don't eat too much of a dead cap hit if they were to walk away from him in the offseason. They may even just keep him around as the swing tackle, because
maybe
it's not a terrible problem to have three guys that are capable of starting at tackle, and having one, obviously, that you really believe in now. Hopefully they really believe in Broderick Jones by now. Starting, though, at right tackle makes a ton of sense. So before we get to Is This a Thing, I took a look at the strength of schedule for the three wild card teams that currently sit in those positions in the AFC. They're all in the AFC North, by the way. You've heard that mentioned over the last couple of days, that all four AFC North teams would go to the playoffs if they started today. The strength of schedule is an important piece of this, though.
Yes.
For example, the Bengals at 5-3 currently have the most difficult remaining schedule in the NFL. Harder than anybody. They've got, let's see, Houston, Indianapolis, Minnesota, Cleveland, and the Steelers at home.
Minnesota becomes a problem now.
Yeah, and to be honest, Indy's still kind of lurking back there in the picture as well.
They fight. I give them credit. They fight.
Yeah. What's more interesting is the road slate for Cincinnati. They've only got 4 road games left, but this is brutal. The Steelers are the easiest of the 4 on December 23rd. They've also got Jacksonville on the road. They've got Kansas City on the road on New Year's Eve, remember?
And ahead in December.
And coming up in just a couple of weeks, they go to Baltimore on a Thursday night. So
that feels like an automatic loss.
It feels like it should be, right? It's Thursday night on the road, a divisional opponent.
You face that defense on a short week?
Yeah.
And all your bruises ain't really healed up yet?
So the Bengals have 3 games left against teams with 6 wins or more, and all 3 of them happen to be on the road, one of them on a short week. They've only got 1 game left against a sub-500 team, and that's the Colts. So Cincy's schedule is imposing. Now,
that's rough.
That's also probably the best team out of these 3 as far as how they're playing right now, right?
Agreed, yes.
Since he's figured some things out, they handled Buffalo on Sunday night. They look good right now. I think it really comes down to a closer examination to the Steelers and the Browns, right? Because not only do they still have a game left against each other, but they've got very similar schedules down the stretch. The advantage being the Steelers have that direct tiebreaker over the Browns right now. But the Browns have Green Bay, Arizona. Is it Green Bay in Arizona? Hold on, let me make sure I have this right. No, they don't have Green Bay in Arizona. Do they? Man, they do. It's amazing how much of this lines up. So the Browns have the Jets on a Thursday night at home later in the season. They've also got the Jags. They've got the Bears at home. And they've got the Steelers at home. Their home slate, I don't want to say they're coasting, but it's
very manageable.
Manageable. That's a nice way to put it.
Very manageable.
Not much better on the road. They do have to visit Baltimore still, and they've got Denver on the road, the Rams on the road, and then Houston and Cincinnati. So they're right around 500, their remaining schedule, the Browns. The Steelers are who have Green Bay, Arizona, New England. Their schedule, the Steelers' schedule, down the stretch, the 3rd easiest in the AFC, the 11th easiest in the league, and the easiest of these 3 teams currently sitting in wild card position in the AFC North. All of this is to say that depending on what the other teams, Buffalo, Houston, the Jets, the Colts, even, depending on what they do, and I don't know if either of us has a ton of belief in the Jets or Colts at this point, but the Texans, CJ Stroud may be figuring some things out.
I like what Houston's doing. I said before the season I liked what Houston was doing, so that didn't shock me.
So Houston may be figuring some things out, and the Bills are still there too. And inconsistent Bills, sure.
They're always still in it, regardless of what their record is, because Josh Allen's there.
True. Exactly. So one of these two AFC North teams is going to get bounced from the picture. I think it's bound to happen, at least one of them. Right. And when I look at the schedule and I look at what's played out so far and what's left to play out, yeah, the Cardinals will get Kyler Murray back, sure. And you never know what may happen, for example, in other spots on people's schedules. Do the Raiders all of a sudden figure things out because they get the new coach bounce, as they seemingly did against the Giants this past weekend. Anything's possible. There will be other injuries. But it sets up for the Steelers that, and I've said this before, I know I'm repeating myself, but they need 5 wins to get into the playoffs to end up 10-7. If you just rattle off Green Bay, Arizona, New England, and Indy, that only leaves one more win between Seattle and your 4 division games.
That's a pretty good position to be in.
Yeah.
And let's say you win 2 of those 5 division games. Or is it 4 division games?
4.
Split the division games.
Yeah.
Split the 4.
Split the division games. Split the division games, and you're 4-2 in the North now because they've already beaten Baltimore and Cleveland once each. And again, you're probably not catching the Ravens for the division. Probably not. But crazier things have happened. And we're just talking about getting in the playoffs here. We're not even talking about anything beyond that. So it does set up. I hate to, I saw them talking on ESPN this morning about, they were giving teams midseason grades and things like that. And I think Dan Graziano gave the Steelers a C+, and everyone else freaked out. RG3, Dominique, they all freaked out. Like, oh my God, how can you give them a C+? And he's like, well, look at them. They're just not very good. They've won games that maybe other teams wouldn't have won, but they've got a negative point differential. They've been outgained in every game. They're all very valid points, and I tend to agree with Dan's side of the argument here. I don't think they're a great team, but like we talked about again Sunday afternoon on your show, sometimes we get caught up as Steeler fans in wanting them to be the 13-win division champ all the time, and you don't need that to make a run all the time. Hell, what was it, 1984? Was it the 84 season? 84 season, they went to an AFC championship game with David Woodley as their quarterback.
Yep.
And they lost, but that was a classic example of just be good enough, get into the dance, win a game or two. 89, I think it was, not a very good team. It was Rod Woodson, Gary Anderson, and a bunch of dudes. Mm-hmm. Bubby Brister quarterback most of the season. If not for a Gary Anderson walk-off field goal against the Oilers in the final week of the season.
I'm old enough to remember that playoff game.
I remember, a quick aside, it was late enough in the year that we were decorating the Christmas tree in our apartment. Yes. This is when I lived in Texas for a couple of years. And my dad, who grew up, never left Texas really, probably thought you needed a passport to leave the state, had been a lifelong Love You Blue Oilers fan. And we're decorating the Christmas tree as a family, him, my mom, me, and we're watching this Steelers-Oilers game. I'm like, 10 years old? And I'm just like, hey, look at this. And like Ernest Givens would pull down this incredible catch, and he'd be like, hey, look at that, with his McConaughey voice and all. And I just back and forth. And Gary Anderson hits that kick, and I just remember going nuts. And I just remember my dad silently fuming, knowing that his kid was happy, which was good for him, but at the same time being like, I can't believe this Steelers team just bounced my Oilers out of the playoffs. This is ridiculous. But that 89 team, they won a wild card round and then went to Denver and were within a hair on Tim Worley's chin of going to an AFC championship game, but he coughed the ball up late. Like, my point is,
Tyrone Braxton was the one that recovered the fumble, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think you might be right. And because it wasn't Atwater, I would remember that more clearly. But yeah, I think it was Braxton. I mean, hell, look at the Super Bowl 40 team. That was.
I was going to bring that up.
For younger
They were
fans.
6-6. They were 6-6 going into that game against the Bears, and they rattled off that 4-game win streak. I was there at Heinz Field for that game against Chicago, sitting in
The
the north end
Urlacher
zone in the 200
steamroll.
section.
Yeah.
For Jerome Bettis runs through Brian Urlacher at the goal line, and that was the loudest to this day I've ever heard that place sitting in there as a fan. It's the loudest I've ever heard it. The roar that went up from that place was absolutely insane. And the rest, they say, is history. After that game. They rattled off that win streak. They got in as a wild card, and they won 3 road games to get to the Super Bowl. And I don't think people saw that 05 team doing that at the time. I think we felt like 04 was the year, and then it didn't happen. Because remember, Jerome, like Ben Roethlisberger consoling Jerome Bettis after that game because Ben
Hines
felt like
Ward
he let everybody down.
Hines Ward in tears the next day for his press conference, for his meeting with the media. Yeah, we thought it was the 92 Pirates. We thought it was the 92 Pirates. Yeah.
We thought 04 was the year. And then they went on that run in 05 and won the whole thing. And then, Jerome Bettis got to play in Detroit for his final game. The defense shows up with the Dick LeBeau jerseys, which I thought was the most awesome thing ever at the time. But like that run happened and it changed our entire perspective on that particular team and what they did. And it should have changed our perspective on what's possible with a playoff run. I'll take you back to the late 90s with the 97 Broncos team that made it as a wild card and beat this very Steelers organization at Three River Stadium in the playoff game. You never know how it could go.
Yeah, and look, this isn't to sit here and blow smoke up everybody's rear end and try to tell them that this is a Super Bowl team. That's not what we're trying to do.
We're establishing precedent is what we're doing.
And what I want to do is, because in this world of very binary arguments where everything is either awesome or terrible, I think it's important to remember that sometimes when you find the nuance of what's happening right there in the middle of the road, you can find the most satisfying moments, because it's not, oh my God, everything's the worst, this is awful, or everything's great, this is awesome. No, it's, oh man, 1 second, I think this is the best thing ever. The next second, I think it's the worst thing ever. I am riding a roller coaster of emotions. I am in a glass case of emotion, in fact, to quote Anchorman. And that is where you find the most fun sometimes, I think, as a fan. We need to remind ourselves of that this, just because they're the Pittsburgh Steelers doesn't mean every championship run is going to start with a 13-win regular season. Conversely, remember that not every 13-win regular season necessarily ends in a championship run. I'll go all the way back for the old heads that may be listening to this or watching it on the YouTube page. Remember your 76
It was Tyron Braxton, by the way, in 89. I went back and looked it up.
Thank you for looking it up. Remember the 76 Steelers? They had the arguably greatest defense of all time. They smothered opponents. And what would they have? 6 shutouts, something crazy like that? It may have been even
something
more.
like that, yeah.
And they get to the playoffs.
That was the best team that didn't win it, if you ask anybody that was around at that time.
Absolutely. They get to the playoffs. Rocky and Franco both get hurt. They got nobody to run the ball out in Oakland in the AFC Championship game, and they lose, and the Raiders go on. And look, man, that's the way it goes sometimes. You can have a great regular season, and it falls apart in the playoffs. We've seen that. Hello, Blake Bortles. You can have a middling regular season, just get into the tournament. That shouldn't be the stated goal. And I think all too often the last half decade, that has become, unfortunately, what they've aimed for, because maybe the organization understands the limitations of the talent available to them. And maybe they need to take a good, long, hard look. You and I have talked about this as well, to not get too 50,000-foot view on things and not too 20/20 hindsight on things, but take a look back at the talent that was acquired over the last half decade, in the draft in particular. I love you, Kevin Colbert. I'll give you all your flowers, but some of those drafts weren't the best, Devin Bush. And so
you got to call both sides of the coin. You
do. And so I guess the greater point I'm trying to drive at, without getting too long-winded, and I tried to drive at this when we talked on Sunday night, was, hey, man, if it's up and down and they end up 10-7, but they upset a Jacksonville in the wild card round, and all of a sudden they're, I don't know, going to Baltimore in the divisional round, and hell, who knows what can happen. Like, I don't expect it to happen that way. I don't expect to look up and see them in Cincinnati for an AFC Championship game. But wouldn't that just be the kind of crazy-ass run you could see a team like this putting together? It's not expected, but if we looked up and that were to be the way it played out, I don't want people to have given up on things because it isn't perfect. Embrace the ugliness that happens sometimes. Bubba Sparks time, right?
Yes, indeed. I've had this discussion with people like so much during the course of this past couple weeks. I'm sitting here going, if we knew the last chapter of the story, there would be no reason to read the book. If you knew what it said on the last page, what are you looking at the first one for?
Right.
If we knew how this was going to go, if it went according to our expectations, there'd be no reason to watch. And people are going, "Oh, it's so hard to watch games these days." I'm going, "Why?" They're like, "Oh, because they're not winning games a certain way." I said, "Is that the only reason? Is that the reason why this is so hard to watch? Is because of how it's happening, as opposed to just the fact that we're getting to that last chapter? If that's the reason, then you're already watching for the wrong reason to begin with.
Right.
If you're watching to see how the game unfolds, then watch to see how the game unfolds. If you're watching to see it happen a certain way, you're already walking in expecting to be disappointed, or you're already walking in expecting the unexpected, because you can't expect a team to be a certain way when they haven't proven that they can play a certain way. The old Albert Einstein saying, and I use this a lot, everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish on its ability to climb a tree, it's going to live the rest of its life thinking it's stupid. It'll also live the rest of its life forgetting that it couldn't climb a tree because, as Ted Lasso would say, goldfish is a 30-second memory. But that's beside the point. But you see where I'm going with this. Like, if we keep judging this team on what it can't do,
Right.
then we'll never be able to understand what it is doing, and probably never appreciate what it is doing. And I understand Dan Graziano's point. On paper, they're not doing it the way everybody else is doing it. But I talked about this Sunday afternoon too. We get mad because this team is winning games with its defense and the turnover margin. Folks, the two best teams in the league, or at least the best in each conference, Kansas City and San Francisco, they're doing the exact same thing. Mm-hmm. They're winning games with their defense. They're both top 5 scoring defenses. Kansas City's averaging 23 points a game on offense and 16 on defense. They're doing the exact same things, because I think going into this season, they knew, hey, we're not going to light it up the way we used to, because we don't even know who half our receivers are. So we're going to have to do this a different way. And they're doing it a different way. You got to do whatever it takes with what you have to win games. And this is something that people just don't seem to appreciate with Mike Tomlin. He can take what he has and win games with it. I'm going to go back to 2019 because we love to forget this part. He got 6 quarters out of Ben Roethlisberger and lost his first 2 games, and then with 8-6 afterwards with Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges. Sometimes you got to take what you got and make the most of it. And that's what this team is going to have to do. And that's what they've done so far.
Yeah, I want people to understand that while the expectation can be set up, yeah, the schedule sets up well for them to make a run down the stretch, get into the playoffs. Let's understand that there's a certain prism to watch all of this through, which is you can have your expectations, you can have your hopes, but also understand that, you know what, there's another side to the coin, in that you can't expect them to always be exactly what it's not always going to be pretty, I guess.
It's not even meeting this organization's own expectations if you go by what they told us before the season started. Remember, I harped on this after the Houston game, how they told us this is how they wanted to play and this is what they wanted to be. They haven't even met their own expectations. You think they're worried about ours? Honestly? Like, you really think they care about what we expect when they're not even meeting their own expectations? You got to step out of the box for a little bit and step into reality for 15 seconds and just acknowledge things sometimes for how they are. And this is what this team is. But the good thing is they're starting to figure out more and more of what they're capable of along the way. I thought the Tennessee game on offense was a big step for them, because you saw a big growth in the run game. You saw a lot more balance in the passing game, and you saw Kenny Pickett start to trust his guys up front a lot more, which should, keyword being should, be a big indication down the road that continues to progress.
Yeah, when we look at building the game plan later in the week, one of the things I want to watch for, dependent upon Green Bay personnel, obviously, is what's still lacking there, which is like the middle of the field, especially deep down the middle of the field, and starting to connect on some of those. But we can save that for later in the week. Let's spend a couple minutes playing our favorite game here on 4th Down in the Steel City. Is this a thing? Producer Greg Finley, jump on in here, my friend. There you go.
Hey.
Swapped around, so you're right in the middle. We've got a few items here. Let's start with, I just happened to see this in passing this morning. Martavis Bryant is trying out for the Cowboys. Explain this. Is this a thing?
Yeah, he got reinstated, and he was playing in a couple of different leagues before he got reinstated by the NFL, but it looks like the Cowboys are working him out. And I'm going to say that this is not going to be a thing, though. I think he's been away from the NFL too long for him to just come back and be with the Dallas Cowboys. But it wouldn't surprise me if this is a Jerry Jones move, because he does like to make these kind of moves. I mean, he wanted Odell Beckham Jr. after he tore his ACL.
Yeah.
He goes for the home runs, and sometimes they are not home runs.
Josh, is this a thing? Martavis back in the league?
I think ultimately it won't, because you're going to have to find a team that's desperate enough to need a guy like him to make that run, but they're going to have to bring him in, bring him totally up to speed, and in a limited role, try to get him to, do at least in a limited capacity some of the things that might be necessary. I think it would be a thing if this was at the beginning of the season, when you had time to slowly bring him along. Yeah. If he would have been reinstated, say, like either right before or right after training camp, and someone can bring him in and probably can kind of, guide him along, I think this would be a thing. I think the fact that this is happening in November, I don't think it is a thing at this point. I really do think he's a guy who still can bring something to a team, but I feel like some of these teams right now are so far along and they're so close to knowing what they need to know. I think bringing this kind of guy in that really can't acclimate to everything you want to do might be too much of a risk. So given the timing of it all, and I reported on this, I anchored on it on Saturday night over at KDK and talked about it. I feel like the timing of it all is what makes it not a thing.
You know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of the Eagles signing Julio Jones this year. Like, why did they do that? And he only has a couple of receptions this year. And yeah, he's got 4 receptions this season.
Yeah,
he's got 2 receptions this season.
In Julio's case, I could understand it a little bit more because he's a little closer to, in departure from his. It's been less. Yeah. It's been. I can't put words together today. It hasn't been as long since he was productive, Julio, as it has been for Martavis. I mean, it's been 5 years since he even set foot on an NFL field, Martavis.
Right.
But your point remains the same. It's a flyer. It's a hope. It's a wish. And no, I don't think we're going to see Martavis on an NFL field. That'd be great for him if it worked out. Good luck, but I don't think it's a thing. All right, I'm going to bring this one up, even though it might be opening a can of worms.
Oh boy,
because I know how Greg feels about it, because we've texted about it a lot over the last few days.
I know where this is going.
Harbaugh's not getting suspended. And I don't say that as like a hope or a wish, because I'd love to see him get suspended this weekend. In fact, can we make that happen? Huh?
Ooh,
maybe, but it's not going to happen.
Everything.
I don't think it's going to happen. If anything happens, there will be some sort of whatever you want to call it, consequence handed down after the season is over, because they're going to want due process to play out in this case. Heather Dinich made a great point about that this morning on ESPN.com. They're going to let due process play out, because otherwise this thing's going to end up in court, which is going to make it drag out even longer. Either way, Harbaugh's not getting suspended this year. There's not going to be any impact on the Michigan Wolverines. And unfortunately, Connor Stallions becomes a bit of a folk hero in Ann Arbor. That, I can guarantee, is a thing. Greg, I know this upsets you very much so.
Do you see who they brought in yesterday at University of Michigan to help pump them up or whatever?
Oh, Ric Flair.
They brought in Ric Flair.
Oh, yeah. Hey, if you're going to be accused of cheating, who better to bring in than the dirtiest player in the game, right?
Right.
Woo! Fits the profile.
I don't know, guys. I still think that something could happen here. I honestly don't think they're going to get the death penalty, which I think that they deserve for cheating, but I know that it's not going to happen. But I do think that Harbaugh could get suspended. But I also think too, he could leave Michigan at the end of the year and go to the NFL.
That's what I was going to say. You know where he's going to serve that suspension? In Chicago.
That's where I am with this. I think it happening this season is not a thing. I think some form of punishment will come at the end of the year, because I think Chris pointed it out. Michigan has already gone Andrew Garfield in the social network, telling what's his face, the guy that played Mark Zuckerberg, to his face, lawyer up, because that's what Michigan already did.
Oh, and they're already doing a great job of throwing other rumors out there about other Big Ten teams too.
Yeah, this is Andrew Garfield to Jesse Eisenberg, lawyer up because I'm coming for the whole thing. And that's what Michigan's going to try to do to delay this as much as they possibly can. So they can push this down to the end of the season. And the Big Ten, if the Big Ten can say, hey, we don't want to mess up our chances to having at least one team in the playoff at the moment. Let's see if we can keep this going and if we can get our best team in the playoff. Because if they mess this up now, the Big Ten will kick itself forever. And they don't want to be the Big 12 5 years ago. They don't want to try to screw that up. Or was it like 6 years ago? They don't want to have that opportunity and fumble it. So I feel like it'll be a thing in February, March, but not a thing in November, December. And by then, it'll just so happen that maybe a job out in LA might open up with the Chargers, or maybe another opportunity might open up. And Jim Harbaugh's going to say, you know what? I won't take that contract extension because I'm going to go and take this one. Although Chicago, I will say, Chris, I don't see that one happening because you know who the president of the Bears is? The former president or the former commissioner of the Big Ten?
Oh,
didn't really like John Harbaugh. So
yeah. That's true.
I don't see Kevin Warren and Jim Harbaugh probably coexisting in Chicago.
I hadn't thought of that.
I think LA with a very capable Justin Herbert sounds very good, though.
Oh man, would he gloriously screw that up?
The Chargers are going to get rid of Brandon Staley. They beat the Jets last night, Josh. What are you talking about? They're winning again.
Greg, you know my stance on Brandon Staley.
I do. I know your stance, but I don't think the Chargers care.
If that's the case,
they brought him back already once.
Well, it wouldn't be the first time the Chargers have done that, right? Because North Turner being there was a thing too, and they kept saving North's job every other year. So it wouldn't be the first time the Chargers were okay with such a thing. But no, to get back to the main part of this, I think something will come down on Michigan, but I'll be stunned if it happens before the end of the season. It'll be after the playoff is over, and maybe after Michigan has lifted a trophy or two by then. At least that's what Michigan's hoping for. And maybe by then, a lot of the flies will be off and Jim Harbaugh will be gone. So I don't think it's a thing as far as this season.
I got to ask, is this a thing as far as it being bad? Shams tweeting last night. Lakers star Anthony Davis had a spasm of his groin and is attempting to see if he can return for the second half versus the Heat. Young Gregory is on during this, so I'll try to keep it as clean as possible. I don't know how many spasms of the groin I've had that I didn't enjoy, to be quite honest. Is this a thing?
I think this is a thing because Anthony Davis just keeps finding new ways to get hurt. And I say that as both an NBA observer and a frustrated Laker fan. But I will also say this probably isn't a thing because, I mean, I'm sure you can pay for that kind of thing in LA, but that's usually not what you do during the game.
No, not during a game.
I'm going to ultimately lean toward this not being a thing.
I just pictured Deshaun Watson going, I know a masseuse for that.
hey, if you get that going on in Houston, I know a guy or a couple. Just saying.
Greg, is this really a
spasm off the rails?
A spasm of the groin? Is this a thing?
It's Anthony Davis being himself, which is a big baby. Okay. He'll be back. He'll be back tomorrow. He'll be back on the floor tomorrow, being himself again, and he'll land on his leg funny, and he'll be limping, and he'll be off the floor again. Just talk to Doran of what he thinks about Anthony Davis. He gives the best analysis about this guy.
I believe usually it starts and ends with, oh my God.
Greg and I talk about this so much, with me being a Laker fan, and he understands my frustration with all of it. I'm going to end with this. Greg knows I refer to the Lakers as Bruno, and we don't talk about Bruno.
That's probably a good idea in this case to not talk about AD's groin either.
That being said, though, LeBron said the Lakers are the Steelers of the NBA. That is a thing.
That's what I read that once. I was like, what? And then I read it a second time, and I was like, I did the Alonzo Mourning gif. I did the. He's kind of right. He's kind of right. You're right.
He also said that every time he bets against Mike Tomlin and the Steelers, they win. So maybe that's doing that too.
All right, last thing. Josh invented something right before we came on the air. It's called Chooksing yourself. Chooksing yourself. Is this going to become a phrase that Steelers fans use with regularity? Is this a thing, Greg?
It should be. But go ahead, Greg.
Of course it's a thing. Josh has invented it. It's going to catch fire, man. Absolutely, it's a thing.
Okay.
I can't take credit for it because if Mike Tomlin hadn't said it, I doubt we even know what chooksing yourself is. But the fact that he mentioned that, Chooks Okorafor said whatever he said at the end of the Jacksonville game, and Chooks even said he was acting out at the end of the Jacksonville game, and that might be the thing that Wally pips him out of the lineup for Broderick Jones. So chooksing yourself is kind of like an indirect Wally Pipp thing because Wally Pipp got hurt, in fairness.
Right.
Chooks just, apparently shot off at the mouth and got himself messed up. But I will say this. Who among us hasn't had a bad day at work where we say something crazy and get in trouble with the boss?
Oh, yeah. We all been there. In this industry, definitely.
Yeah, so I say chooksing yourself is a thing at this point.
What about Deontay chooksing himself about the officials and getting a
that was the clear chooksing yourself. That's perfect.
Definitely.
Perfect example. Deontay has already chooked himself. There you go.
Yeah,
it's a thing.
It's a thing. It's become a thing already. Fourth down in the Steel City, Tuesday recaps of Mike Tomlin's press conference, definitely a thing as this one was. We appreciate you joining us. Building the game plan, it's also a thing. We'll do that later in the week to get you prepared for the X's and O's and schematics and what we think should go down Sunday at Heinz Field. I won't call it Acrisure between the Steelers and Packers. And of course, you got to make sure, our hot sheet episode to get you ready for all of the NFL slate this weekend too. All coming up later in the week, Greg.
We had a good week, as they say in draft day. We had a good week. That was us this week in Hot Sheet.
Nice. I look forward to the results in that episode. And of course, if you want to get any of these episodes as soon as they're available here on the YouTube page, if you're watching, you just tap the little notification bell down there and you will get notified as soon as new videos are posted to the 93.7 The Fan YouTube page, including new episodes of Fourth Down in the Steel City. And of course, if you're listening to the audio only version inside your Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcasts, make sure you follow and subscribe so that you get it the next time it's available, the latest episode. Thank you to Greg Finley for producing, Josh Taylor for co-hosting. I am Chris Mack right here on Fourth Down in the Steel City.